Greetings, friends. I've been meaning to do this synopsis and review of the famous work of literature Candide, also known as Optimism, by the French writer Voltaire. And why am I reading this book? Well, because I study French and I wanted to immerse myself in a good book, to learn the language, but also it's a famous book, so why not? You can kind of kill two birds with one stone when you're studying another language. So here's the book here. It's only 153 pages, and I did read it in French, and obviously French is I'm not perfect at it, but my reading knowledge is pretty good, and I went over it, and I translated anything I didn't understand. So I've been at this for a while here, so I'm going to, give you the plot, and I don't think I can get in trouble because I'm not saying anything word for word, even off the internet. I only use the internet to, research a few things, but it's all my own words here, but it's not my story, of course. And then I'll give you what are the insights, what are my insights, because it's a famous book and kind of has, I think, some relevance for our troubled modern times. So who was Voltaire? Voltaire, of course, is a famous French writer, philosopher, born in 1694, died in 1778. Fairly long for those days. I mean, in the 18th century, a lot of people wouldn't live past the age of 30. And a lot of children died before the age of 5. So Voltaire was very lucky and blessed. So it's interesting that he's, he must have experienced a lot of disaster in his life. And he moved around. He didn't stay in France. He was a famous writer, and he traveled. And he briefly spent time with a royalty and then got out of that situation because it's kind of getting dangerous for him. He was constantly questioning the establishment, critiquing the Catholic establishment, advocating free speech, advocating freedom of religion, and he was also known for his wit, his humor, and so that's why he was kind of a figure that was often had to run. But he ended up settling down near the Swiss border, near Geneva, but in France, and that's when he wrote this book. He wrote Candide in 1759, when the war between France and the United Kingdom, or the English and Scotland was raging at that time. So that's the context. So let's get into it here. What is the book about? Who is Candide? Candide is the name of a young man. He is the protagonist of a novel, a young German man. And he's the son of the sister of a baron. And this sister of a baron just had Candide with a common man, not a man of any notable status. So for some reason, they don't really say, but Candide does not grow up with his real parents. He grows up in the castle of his uncle, the baron, in Germany. I guess this is kind of close to France, but in Germany. Imaginary chateau. And he's mentored during that time by the philosopher known as Pangloss, whom Candide really likes. Pangloss is always impressing Candide with his idea that everything is for the best, even events which seem terrible. And then, not long after that, because the plot moves really quickly, he's always, trying to move the plot along very quickly. So right after he gets impressed with this idea that everything is for the best, he falls in love with, basically, it seems to be his cousin, Cunégonde, who is also the daughter of the baron. So Candide unwisely gets physical with her in the grounds of the chateau, well, just outside the chateau, but on their property, and he's immediately found out by the baron, who drives Candide away, trying to beat him, and just drives him right away. And at that point, Candide gets taken advantage of by two older men, and he's pressed into service as a soldier with the Bulgarians. So they just say the Bulgarians. And this did happen at that time. Sometimes the way the story is going to develop is not very believable, but Voltaire is taking a lot of very believable incidents, but he's putting them all together in this ridiculous fashion. So the plot isn't really believable, but people really did get impressed. If you were astray in the countryside and you didn't have food and you didn't have money, what happens is they'd feed you and they'd be like, oh, well, you'd think the meal is on them because they'd be treating you, but then they're like, oh, so are you gonna pay? And you'd be like, I don't have any money. And they're like, well, you're in the army now. And that's what happens to Candide. So when he's in the army, he immediately, because the plot has to keep moving in this 153-page, relatively short book, he does something against the rules. And he's forced to be whipped by an entire regiment, 2,000 men, And it's, pretty bad because that would flay your skin and you could die of an infection. There weren't really antibiotics back then. And actually, they were actually going to cut off his head. But at that moment, the king of the Bulgarians, they don't say who, he happens to be passing by and gives Candide clemency. So Candide ends up recovering. He's nursed to health by a surgeon, only in time to take part in a battle against the Avars. I don't know who the Avars are. It seems like Voltaire might have been playing around with a word for Arabs. I'm not sure. So in this, it's a terrible battle, and Candide flees during confusion because he doesn't want to obviously stay there. And he goes on the run because either the Bulgarians or the Avars find him, they will kill him. But he manages to get out of the theater of war, and he arrives in Holland because he hears that Holland is a rich, prosperous country, but he ends up begging on the street, and the Dutch are like, hey, you better, if you keep doing this, you're going to end up in a house for correction that's going to teach you how to learn to live. And but luckily, a well-meaning man named Jacques finds Candide, and he's friendly, and he sets him up working in his manufactory for Persian fabric. And at that time, Candide also runs into his former mentor, Pangloss, in the street. So surprised to see him there. Pangloss looks horrible, and initially Candide doesn't recognize him, and he learns from Pangloss that the chateau was burned by the Bulgarians, and everyone from there is dead. Not only dead, but murdered in the most terrible ways. Pangloss is sick with syphilis, and he speaks of diseases coming to Europe from the Americas. But he maintains his philosophy that, everything is still for the best, because if we didn't open up the Americas, we wouldn't have cochineal and we wouldn't have chocolate. Cochineal is a type of dye. So we wouldn't have these nice dyes, spices, sugar colonies giving us sugar and coffee. We wouldn't have all of that. So you got to get syphilis. I mean, we gave much more diseases the other way, but that's another subject. So anyways, that's kind of a mockery of Pangloss. And then he recovers, though, from his sickness, and he travels with Candide and Jacques on a business trip to Lisbon, Portugal, but they are there's a storm in the harbor, and in the confusion, Jacques ends up going overboard. Their benefactor basically drowning in the ocean, and at that moment, Candide wants to dive in after him. But Pangloss stops him and says, no, it's for the best. The ocean claimed him. And so you can look at that as philosophy of Pangloss's, silly idea that. But on the other hand, Pangloss is actually acting here. He's actually saying no. He doesn't want Candide to die, because if you jump in the water, you're obviously going to drown also. So I think he was actually taking some initiative there. So they manage to, and there's a shipwreck, and somehow they survive. Candide and Pangloss survive, only to experience an earthquake in Lisbon, which causes massive destruction. And right after that, Candide and Pangloss get into trouble with the locals, and the locals object to Pangloss, sort of espousing his philosophy that, everything's happening for the best, and they're really religious. It's a religious cult. And so they actually are going to hang Pangloss, and it appears that he is about to be hung, but Candide doesn't actually get to witness that. He is beaten because he's sort of like associated with Pangloss, but Candide manages to get away, and he's cared for by an old woman, who's another character they're bringing in here. They never name her; they just call her the old woman, La Vieille. So he discovers through this old lady, Cunégonde. She's miraculously still alive. The woman he desires. Somehow, despite being removed from her all the time, he still desires Cunégonde. It's kind of a dream, and that's the tying thing through the plot. He's constantly trying to find Cunégonde. She's not a very developed character either. As you'll see, Candide is not a very deep character. He basically just reacts to everything. He has no real substance. And Cunégonde is pretty simple as well. And not really even developed that much, but she's constantly at the light at the end of the tunnel that Candide is hopelessly trying to get there. So, he discovers Cunégonde. She tells him her own sad story of how she ended up in Portugal, basically being bought and sold by various men, all of whom raped her. Most recently, Cunégonde is the property of a Jewish merchant, Don Issachar. And that man tries to attack Candide physically, but Candide has a gun and he shoots him dead. And so now Candide has murdered a man, and he has to flee with Cunegonde and the old woman. And they go to the ocean and they embark for the New World into Brazil, to the territory of Brazil. In those days, that was controlled by the Jesuit priests, who were having kind of their own rebellion against the kings of Spain and Portugal. So kind of a place where he could escape royal authority. So he arrives there, and because of his experience in the Bulgarian army, Candide is given a post in the Jesuit army. I didn't know the Jesuits had an army. Honestly, I just thought they were like priests. Apparently they had an army. And he's commanding a company of infantry. And, by the way, during the sea voyage, the old woman tells her own sad story. A lot of sad stories in this book. It's pretty much one series of sad stories after another in a sort of comedic blend of dark humor. So she tells that, I had it even worse than you, Cunegonde. I was the daughter of a pope. And then she tells how she was, her fiance was poisoned, and then they left. And went on a sea voyage, and they were boarded by Moroccans, and she was sold into slavery in Morocco, and a whole laundry list of terrible things. So basically, she's like, I've had it worse than anyone. But so she's basically telling that story, and then they arrive in Buenos Aires. And at that time, Candide, so I guess not Brazil, they go to Buenos Aires. But at that time, Cunegonde has to, she decides to marry or become the mistress of the governor of Buenos Aires, who basically wants her for himself. But Candide doesn't have much of a choice. He still has to flee, because he could still be caught by the authorities, who are apparently pursuing him over the ocean, which is hard to imagine happening back then. I guess it could happen. Sort of one of the funny things that happens is really hard to believe. I mean, everything's hard to believe in, but at that moment, he suddenly befriends this mixed race young man named Cacambo, who becomes like his good friend and his faithful servant, like right away. So they go to meet the Jesuits. They go to meet up with that army. So when he meets the commander of the troops, when Candide, approaches them, he discovers that he knows the commander. The commander is the brother of Cunegonde, who Candide thought was killed during the sacking of the chateau by these Bulgarians. But clearly he survived. The two men are so overjoyed to see each other again. But no sooner have they met than Candide mentions, he's like, yeah, I plan to marry your sister. And then all of a sudden the man just gets really angry, and he's like, no way could you do that. She holds 72 districts. Like she owns land. She's from a princely family. And who are you? You're no one. Basically, that's the idea. And then I guess he strikes Candide, and Candide shoots him dead. Again. So he's killed another person just like that. That's, again, not really believable, I know. But so he's killed this guy. Now he really has to run from the Jesuits. So he's fucking up his plan. And but for whatever reason, Cacambo, so faithful, and they're like, let's get out of here. So they keep on going. They go into the wild. They must flee into the interior of South America. They venture very far into unknown territory, traveling on horseback. And then they encounter two young native women who are running from two monkeys that seem to be biting them. And, it looks like those monkeys are kind of hostile. So Candide shoots the two monkeys. And then Cacambo's like, oh, you really shouldn't have done that. Those two monkeys were the lovers of the young women. And the young women are really upset, and they complain to their fellow tribe members. And then the local tribe comes and surrounds Cacambo and Candide, and they're probably going to be eaten, like they're probably going to be cannibalized. But it's, that doesn't end up happening. I mean, it says that they're being prepared to be boiled alive, because they assume that Candide is a Jesuit who happens to be their enemy, because they're fighting the Jesuits. And then Cacambo tells them that, no, Candide's not a Jesuit. In fact, he killed a Jesuit not long ago. So you see, things do work out for the best. He killed the Jesuits, so actually, you guys should be, welcoming us. And then that actually happens. Unbelievable. Well, the natives kind of take their time. They're like, oh, really? And then they send word, and they're like, yeah, a Jesuit was killed recently. And so, yeah, there you go. So everything works out for the best in that moment. So they basically, they permit the two travelers to continue, and they keep traveling, and they end up in the mystical kingdom of El Dorado, which is identified with the Inca, the remnants or the ancestral homeland of the Incas. It's kind of a stretch. Like, I've been to Peru. I mean, I don't know if you could ever really reach it that easily from Buenos Aires overland. No, you'd want to go the other way. You'd want to go, by ocean to. But anyways, they end up in some mountainous, isolated area, and there's like precious metals and diamonds everywhere. I mean, there's like these hotels for business and travelers. How there's hotels and business and travelers here doesn't make a lot of sense, but there are these establishments for travelers which are supposedly paid for by the government. And they meet this sagely old man who tells them that, where they are. You're in El Dorado, this Incan homeland. And we normally kill any outsiders who will approach our territory, but not many people approach because, we're isolated here. And this old man teaches Candide that his people do believe in God, and only one God, and they give thanks to him all the time, for they have everything they need. Indeed, since their houses are made of gold and silver, and their dishwares are made of diamonds, they do not have priests of any spiritual organization. Each person is their own priest, but they do participate in collective singing. So in my opinion, Voltaire always seems to be hard to believe, and it's kind of easy to believe at the same time. It's kind of funny a thing he has going on there. I mean, houses of gold, dishes of diamonds, that doesn't really seem plausible. But then again, maybe he takes this extreme angle to be funny and ridiculous or to make a point. And at the same time, the spiritual beliefs of the inhabitants of El Dorado kind of seem plausible. I mean, I assume Voltaire was reading some anthropological accounts of his time to gain this understanding, although it seems a little naive, like he just thinks they're like the best, it's the best place ever. So that's a bit of a stretch. But anyways, later, Candide and Cacambo, they actually travel into the capital city of El Dorado, and they're received by the king there. And the king gives them a tour, and there are public buildings stretching up to the clouds. And Candide learns that there's no parliament here. There's no court of justice in the society. Apparently, as they have no need for these institutions, and no one complains. So neither are there any prisons. However, there is the Palace of Sciences, which is full of mathematical instruments and instruments of physics. So I don't think the Incas really had that. So Voltaire's kind of getting a little fanciful here. And they spend 1 month in El Dorado, in the capital, and the king is very benevolent, and it's like the only nice time in the novel when they're in El Dorado. Everything else is dark, but he's very benevolent, and literally they're like, can we just like take a lot of gold and diamonds, and he's like, sure, and like he sends them off with like this 24 sheep, each sheep laden with all like many pounds of gold and diamonds. And it's like, and they escort them to the edge of their kingdom, but no one from El Dorado can accompany them beyond the borders of El Dorado, since they must honor a vow to always remain in the kingdom. So Candide and Cacambo traverse the wild with their herd of sheep. The sheep keep dying off. Like, pretty much as soon as he gets all this money, he like starts losing it, and he's like, for the rest of the book, he's losing money. And they finally get to the Dutch colony of Suriname, and right as they're approaching, they meet this Negro who's missing an arm and a leg, and Negro is just the term that they would have used at that time, and he's missing an arm and a leg, and the Negro tells them that he lost each limb as punishment meted out by this Dutch businessman, Mr. Vanderdonder, who owns a sugar plantation. So at Candide, he's still thinking of getting to Cunegonde, and he sends Cacambo with money to go to Buenos Aires and purchase Cunegonde from the governor, and then travel with her and the old woman, I guess, to Venice to meet Candide. That's the plan. So after Cacambo leaves, Candide tries to negotiate passage back to Europe, and he allows himself to be seriously ripped off of the better part of his fortune. He has no negotiating skills, no apparent knowledge that he's being screwed, and his first attempt to leave goes wrong as the ship leaves without him, but it takes one of his sheep that has a lot of money on it. And actually, that's Mr. Vanderdonder, who ends up being basically a pirate. And so he gets into more headaches because he complains to the Dutch judge in town, but he offends the judge. He doesn't speak very reasonably, and then so he just has more headaches. And but eventually he's finally able to set off, though he has to go to France first. So Candide is really a strange character. I mean, often he seems quite stupid. Other times he seems quite reasonable, even admirable. Just in certain instances when when you can think of being sympathetic to someone else who's suffering, Candide is there to do that, but he's just overall an idiot. So perhaps this is why the story doesn't really have to be plausible. I mean, the story, the plot, and Candide's character, these are more ways of talking about man in general. And on the voyage over the Atlantic, Candide befriends an old wise man named Martin. So Martin now takes on the role of male counterpart to Candide, because as you may have noticed by now, the whole book is it's like dialogue between Candide and someone else, and basically showing Candide to be an idiot to illustrate more interesting philosophical ideas on the part of the person arguing with him. So now it's Martin. It doesn't really matter who Martin is, but he's a pessimistic man. He's suffered a lot. And, both men have suffered greatly, but Martin's still way more pessimistic than Candide. Candide still has this optimism that everything is for the best, because that's what Pangloss impressed upon him. And he still hopes to see Cunégonde again. And but in any case, he has a lot of money. So Martin harbors no hopes at all. He's a Manichaean. Manichaean is defined as an adherent of the dualistic religious system of Manes, a combination of Gnostic Christianity, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and various other elements, with a basic doctrine of a conflict between light and dark, matter being regarded as dark and evil. So at that point in the novel, Candide's ship with Martin, they observe on the ocean two other ships that are fighting in the distance, and both these ships end up sinking. But Candide spots one of his sheep floating in the water, and he's able to retrieve the sheep along with some of the riches. And then Candide tells Martin, he's like, yeah, you see, crimes are punished sometime. This Dutch pirate who screwed me over got what he deserved. Because, the sinking ship was the Mr. Vanderdonder who stole one of Candide's sheep. So he's like, yeah, so you get what, things really do work out in the end. And then Martin replies, he's like, yes, but did the other passengers on this vessel need to perish as well? God has punished the villain, but the devil has drowned the others. That's Martin's words. So that I thought that was kind of a neat quote. So eventually they arrive in Bordeaux, France, and soon Candide heads to Paris on his way to Venice, where he's still going to meet Cunégonde and Cacambo, but he gets seriously sick, and then he recovers. He gets to know an abbot who is familiar with theater. An abbot, kind of like a religious, kind of like a priest, I guess, but higher up. And this abbot is really familiar with theater. He's like a Paris socialite, and kind of strange for a religious man to be going to the theater, don't you think? But anyways, Candide takes fancy with this particular beautiful young actress, and he's surprised to learn that in Paris, actresses are not permitted to be buried in holy ground. They must be buried with beggars. So this young lady is very promiscuous, and she tries to seduce Candide, and he allows himself to be seduced a bit, but nothing actually really happens. Little physical, nothing happens, but overall, what's happening is the abbot is attaching himself to Candide simply to profit from him. And as usual, Candide is completely oblivious. The abbot writes Candide this fake letter claiming to be from Cunégonde, stating that Cunégonde is staying at a hotel nearby in France, and she's really sick, so she needs help. Candide goes to the hotel with lots of money to help her, and he falls into a trap. His money is taken, and he and Martin are imprisoned. But with money, he's able to make friends again, this time with a merchant who takes him to the coast of England now. So a lot of travel in this book. So from the ship, not even arriving in England, not getting off the boat, he witnesses an admiral an English admiral being executed in a ceremony for, quote, not killing enough of the French enemy and not getting close enough to the French admiral during a naval battle. So Candide refuses to set foot in England because he finds this so terrible, and pretty soon they embark for Venice, finally. Initially, they don't find either Cacambo or Cunegonde in Venice, and Candide is really distressed. And Martin remarks, Martin's still tagging along with Candide. He's like, oh, there's little virtue and little happiness on the earth, except perhaps in El Dorado, and no one can go there. Then Candide happens to have another miraculous encounter. He has a lot of these, stumbling into people in other countries that he knows, intimately knows. And who does he meet? He meets Paquette. Paquette she's a chambermaid of Cunegonde's mother. She wasn't really a notable character, but she had an affair with Pangloss. She was actually the one that gave Pangloss syphilis, and she happened to also survive the sacking of the chateau, but she had a terrible story as well, and sold into, raped by men and all that stuff. And then but Candide still gives her money, and she squanders it. Just like they also meet Brother Giroflée, a Theatine. A Theatine was a member of a congregation of regular clerics founded in Italy in 1524 to combat Protestantism and promote higher morality among Roman Catholics. Now, Brother Giroflée tells Candide that he's actually quite miserable as a Theatine, and so are all the other members of his order. So he gives Brother Giroflée some money, but, doesn't make him any happier in the end either. And at that point, Candide and Cacambo go to meet a very wealthy Venetian man. They meet Count Pococurante, and this count has a marvelous collection of art and literature, but he's bored with everything and critical of everything he has. And then you notice at the end of that chapter that the count has nothing in his garden. He just has some pathetic plants there, and they're going to get into that idea of the garden later on. So, finally, after a long and stressful wait in Venice, Candide encounters Cacambo again, who's been sold into slavery, but Cacambo tells him no, Cunegonde is in Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, in Turkey. And so they go there, they travel there. Candide purchases his old friend's freedom, Cacambo's freedom, and at that point, it's difficult to say whether Voltaire is trying to put forth a picture of reality as he tells this story. I mean, basically they get to Constantinople, and this is basically where the novel wraps up. He adopts the philosophy that he sees from a farmer, just living his life, cultivating his garden, and so he does that for a while. Although I guess at the very end, they're like, oh, we want to travel again, we want to have more stimulation again. But for a time, in the end phase of the book, they're just like, oh, we have to cultivate our garden. That's kind of the philosophical conclusion, which is kind of a strange idea. But, it's mostly, most of the book is Voltaire being really pessimistic about humans, pessimistic about life in general, and what can happen. It's difficult to say whether Voltaire is or is not trying to put forth a picture of reality as he tells the story. Well, I guess he is. It's just not doing it as if you actually imagine these things really happening to one person. All of these events, save maybe Candide meeting Cacambo in the Americas, all of these events are normal disasters that happen from time to time. Sickness, war, disease, earthquakes, all of these things happen. But is it really realistic to expect that any person could survive all of these events in succession? I mean, of course not. That's not important. That's not the point. I mean, we've got Candide being horribly whipped in the army, then he's fleeing a murderous battlefield, and he survives a shipwreck and an earthquake, and he's beaten again, and he murders a merchant, has to flee to the New World, and kills another person over there. How many people did he kill? Like 3 or 4 people in the book, and by the way, at the end, Pangloss shows up again, and and Pangloss hasn't changed his philosophy either. He's still optimistic, and perhaps the only likable character is Cacambo, who's more a man of action, very practical, mixed race man from South America, who's like, enough philosophy, we got to do this right now. It's like, we got to get out of here right now, or you got to do this, or he gets stuff done. What does Candide really get done? Not really too much. Well, He mainly reacts to things, but then he is lucky to get all that money. So he got that done. So anyways, it's more like a template, a framework for talking about the world as it was at the time. Voltaire's using Candide as a medium to impress all these experiences on him, not just about man and human nature and the heart of man, but also geography, the known geographical world at the time, the known sort of political issues like war that were going on at the time, tensions between the countries. He's really trying to comment on quite a lot of things. He's almost like trying to make a metaphysical, okay, maybe that's not the right word, but he's really like trying to get a picture of life back then. Life was very hard. That's something that we're much more removed from. Life was very hard in those days, and it must have been impressing on him, because if he published it in 1759, he would have been alive for already, 59 plus 4 or 5. So he was about 64, 65 when he wrote this book, when he published it. So he would have been already an old guy in those times, and he lived a lot longer. But imagine all the things he must have survived. How could you? So you would deal with this question. How would you possibly keep living if you weren't optimistic? I actually think it's a bit of a funny thing he does with this book. I almost think like he is trying to argue for optimism, but he constantly mocks it. It's a real tension that doesn't get resolved. So that's sort of, that's the subject matter, obviously mostly dark and disturbing, but at the same time, it's essentially a comedic book. It's real dark humor. It's a classic of dark humor, if I could call it that. Funny because it's essentially this ridiculous succession of one terrible thing after another, and the joke is for the most part on the young man Candide. I mean, other times the joke is on other people. Mostly Candide bears the brunt of that. His way of thinking is constantly ridiculed, either in his mind, when he's processing, you get into his mind and how he thinks, or he's ridiculed in the minds of others who are constantly like out philosophizing him. So as dumb and unfortunate as Candide is, he still comes across as a good person, like he has a good heart. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to follow his heart, even if it doesn't seem to be taking him in a good direction. But he's completely foolish about Cunégonde. And actually, Voltaire mentions, because at the end he kind of does commit to Cunégonde, and she's become ugly. He says that very clearly, like she's become ugly and she's not quite, but she's faithful and whatever. And her character wasn't developed that much, but it's like he kind of throws that in there as kind of like yet one more joke on Candide. Everything he's been searching for at the end, he doesn't even feel that excited about it in the end when he finally does get Candide or Cunégonde in a place where he can actually have her as his wife. When he actually is in that position, it's a disappointment for him. And he does get her as his wife for some time. But before long, cultivating his small farm outside Istanbul, and what a crazy place to end up. But he wants to travel again. He wants to escape. We don't see if that happens or not. So, yeah, another theme of the book is travel. The characters are constantly on the move, like, Germany to Holland to Portugal to South America, Italy, finally, Turkey. And for this time, when much of the world was still unknown to map makers and historians, Voltaire is putting together what knowledge was available to him. And how does he characterize Islam? Islam is something that comes up here. It's kind of not a major theme, but it's kind of there on the margins. The Muslim world is kind of harsh and cruel. We hear a lot about slavery, about being captured on the Mediterranean and sold into slavery and losing everything. And, in Morocco or in Turkey or what have you. And then we encounter the equal darkness of the savages in the Americas. They may be innocent, but then again, they're cannibalistic. They're isolated. Only El Dorado appears positively. And in retrospect, Voltaire seems a bit naive. I'm not sure if he was trying to be taken seriously when he painted this picture of the isolated Incas as having such a great society. But, of course, he's constantly showing that the civilized world, Europe, isn't much better. So why is Candide a ridiculous character? I think I've already made that clear. I mean, he's just, he has no substance. He's constantly reacting to things. But then the plot is ridiculous. So most of the characters aren't very plausible. Maybe Cacambo is a bit more plausible. But with such a ridiculous plot, you can't really believe in the characters either. What you can believe in is the individual ideas they expressed. Voltaire probably did encounter people in coffee houses or tea houses talking about that kind of stuff. So those are real things. He probably did, have lots of conversations with religious people and people who traveled and all those sorts of things. Well, of course, Voltaire traveled a bit. He didn't leave Europe, but he did travel. So he's more interested in philosophical ideas than in telling a plausible story. But in the end, still a novel, still with characters and all that stuff. Just not quite such deep character development. What insights does Voltaire offer? He discredits or seems to discredit this idea that everything is for the best, that everything, no matter how dark and bad it is, it's for some ultimately good purpose. I'm not so sure if he really discredits it, if he wants to, but the fact is he continually pummels this idea throughout 90% of the novel. But it's almost as though he wants you to root for the underdog. I don't know. So maybe you have a different opinion. And there is some dialogue at the end of the book between Pangloss and Candide to suggest that everything really is for the best. I mean, Pangloss is beginning to doubt his philosophy a little bit at the end of the book, but he's essentially unchanged. He still believes it. Islam, I mentioned, it kind of appears like on the margins. It's kind of like bad, barbarian, kind of not too deep, but not something you want to get into. So Islam doesn't appear too well. How does he characterize women? Well, basically, Cunegond and the old woman. The old woman he does characterize her as more wise. The joke is never on her. Well, she's suffered, but whenever she's in dialogue, the joke isn't on her. She's usually pointing out other people to be. So I guess, he does show her to have more wisdom, but Cunegond is singularly undeveloped. She's just as shallow as Candide. She's not a very developed character, no agency or anything. So then none of the women in the novel have real agency. They're just reacting to things, just like Candide is. But the men, the devilish men, the clever men, are often taking advantage of Candide. So we see a lot of that in the novel. So what do I take away from it? I don't think Voltaire is telling you to be either like Candide or by extension Pangloss. But I don't think he's telling you to become like Martin either, his pessimistic friend who he meets on the voyage back to Europe. Or for that matter, he's not telling you to be like someone like Count Pococurante in Venice. The Count is wealthy. He has all this stuff of art and culture, but he cultivates nothing in his garden. He's also pessimistic as hell. It's kind of like, well, then why you have all this stuff? So, both of these characters, you can admire them for certain reasons and despise them at the same time. So Candide and Pangloss often act blindly. I don't think Pangloss is so reserved, because otherwise, why would he have stopped Candide from jumping into the ocean after their friend, Jacques? Pangloss knew that Candide would also drown. But the smarter Martin doesn't act much either. He just follows Candide around and mutters about everything and tries to just like shoot down everything positive Candide says. Martin is there to say, oh, well, really, it's actually not very nice at all. So yeah, at the end of the book, to wrap this up, I know that I've been blabbing on here for God knows how long. At the very end, Voltaire develops this idea that we should cultivate our garden, as he has Candide doing. Perhaps this idea means that Voltaire is friendly to this idea of optimism. Since why would one work in a garden if one had no hopes to produce anything nice? Or at least Voltaire may be trying to tell us not to waste our thoughts on pessimism, but at least to challenge our energy into work. This stands in kind of an odd contrast to the main idea developed during the novel, which is that life is pretty bad and there isn't much cause for optimism, both in material affairs and in the hearts of other humans. And that's a tension that remains. I wasn't able to resolve it either. So hope you enjoyed that. Hasta luego, amigos.